You're going to hear perhaps the alternative view of crop circles as opposed to the one that you're most familiar with, which is not necessarily going to be one that I'm going to tell you I support. I'm not going to stand here and say, this is what is happening, this is what you must believe. You will form your own opinions. I hope you do. I am doing that, and I'm also, as was just said then, not wedded to any hypothesis at all. My mind has changed several times over the past 12 years. It is quite likely to change again, and I am directed by the events as they happen, not moulding and shaping those events to fit in with a theory or an idea that I've already decided upon. Now, having said all of that, I better make clear what is not true about me. I am not, as George Wingfield is, primarily a crop circle researcher. I got into crop circle research purely by default as a UFO investigator, and because in the early days crop circles and UFOs were indistinguishable to those who reported them. So as the Director of Investigations with the British UFO Research Association, it was really my job to help discover whether or not there was something that the British UFO Research Association should be looking at. And that's how I got involved, right at the start, when the first circles appeared 12 years ago. And I followed them ever since, and I have investigated crop circles myself, but I don't devote all my summers to doing exactly that. So I make that clear so you're not under the illusion that I'm the most learned authority in the world on this subject. That is very far from the truth. Also, I make clear that I'm not a debunker or a skeptic, even particularly by nature. I'm what you might call cautious about most things. My philosophy about both UFOs and crop circles and many other paranormal phenomena is that what we have are reports made by ordinary people who may have been in extraordinary circumstances. And our task is to try to make sense out of those. Now, the first thing that we should do is attempt to discover whether or not those phenomena can in some way be explained in terms of the science that we already know. I think that is the absolute duty of every investigator. And it's something that I certainly try and ingrain upon the team that I work with. In UFO terms, we find explanations for about 95% of all UFO sightings reported to us. And I tell my investigations team, if you start submitting cases where not significantly less than 9 out of 10 of them don't have answers like this was a whatever, then something's wrong with your methodology, because all the facts and figures suggest that you should be doing that. But of course that still means that 5% of the reports don't have explanations, and 5% of several hundred a year in Britain alone, thousands a year all over the world, tens, hundreds, millions maybe, all over the world over the past 50 years or so of the UFO phenomenon as we know it in its modern guise, is a significant number and does represent a problem, or possibly series of interrelated or perhaps even not interrelated, they may be quite separate problems that we need to solve. I also make clear, as you probably heard last night of those of you who listened to the debate about Bentwaters, that I don't rule out at all from the UFO mystery the possibility that there is some kind of alien intervention going on. I don't say that I'm convinced it's happening. I personally don't think it's happening in the traditional sense of spaceships landing, aliens getting out and so on. What I see of the phenomenon is more complicated than that, and that is just simply how the evidence over the years has dictated it to me. But I certainly could not say from what I've seen over the years that it is impossible. I would even say it's not improbable that that's going on. But that is an extreme theory, and as you'll find with crop circles, extreme theories are the third stage that you go to. Once you've actually exhausted the... Thank you.
Very interrupted.
Thank you. Once you've actually exhausted the rational scientific theories and they don't work for any particular case or any particular phenomenon, then you have to move on to the next stage, which is try and extend the boundaries of what is known. We are not at the ultimate limit of our knowledge about the universe. We are going to discover new things. 100 years ago there were many things that scientists didn't know that we do now know now, and that is going to be true 100 years from now. So it's folly to assume that things can't be going on around us now which won't ultimately have an explanation which will seem purely natural, rational, scientific, but which we can't yet quite grasp because it's beyond the present limits of our knowledge. So that is the second stage. See if we can make it fit in with what we know. And only then, that's my premise anyway, only then, if that fails and it looks as if we're dealing with something completely beyond those possibilities, do we start to seek explanations in terms of the completely unknown, the supernatural, if you like. Okay. Now, having said that, I'll make clear that I'm not averse to having to do that on some circumstances. I have personally myself experienced what other people will call paranormal phenomena. I've had an out-of-body experience. I've had several very vivid premonitions, including one of the disaster to the Space Shuttle Challenger, which I have no way of explaining in scientific terms as we understand them now, or as we can begin to understand them by extending the boundaries of knowledge. They do seem to suggest there are more things to this universe than we have even begun to fathom out. So the possibility that that is true about crop circles is certainly there. Right, now having got that out of the way, let's sort of backtrack in time and see the crop circle phenomenon as I followed it, as it came to my attention over these past 12 years. And maybe then you'll get an understanding as to why I've taken the development line that I have. In a way, that's given me an advantage, being there right from the start and following it all the way through, from a sort of outside position rather than directly in the heart of it, involved in one of the crop circle research groups. The people who are involved in the crop circle research groups, and like George, who've been looking at crop circles intensely now for the last 3 or 4 years, have a different set of advantages from having done that, and a different set of disadvantages to the ones that I have. So that's why you're getting two quite different perspectives on this subject. Well, although crop circles began 12 years ago, we now know that they didn't. We have now found many records of crop circles dating back long before then. Records that are not just, as in some cases, dependent upon whether or not an old pamphlet written 300 years ago may or may not be describing a crop circle, but things which were actually investigated at the time in detail and were, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, a crop circle. This is one of the earliest ones that I can absolutely vouch for. It's an incident that happened at a place called Evenlode in Gloucestershire in England. The incident happened in the June of 1960, and it involves what appears to be a double ring formation similar to the ones we have now. I've spoken to the farmer concerned, I've spoken to other people who were out there and looked at this circle. We have very good grounds for believing that it was in fact filmed at the time. We have been making a quite extensive search for photographs of this particular formation. We haven't found them yet, but we have by no means lost hope that they will be found. It was certainly very extensively recorded at the time, the measurements were taken and so on and so forth. So it was, in every sense of the word, as to what we're seeing now, apparently the same sort of thing, which was a local mystery, appeared in a field in the middle of nowhere. At the time, no one really knew what it was. As you can see, the local newspaper decided it was associated with flying saucers, inevitably, and it was a sort of one-day wonder which was soon forgotten. But then, in 1980, in the summer of 1980, a little bit further south in the county of Wiltshire, circles started to appear in a field of oats that was owned by a farmer in the vicinity of Westbury. And he actually found several of these during the months of the summer and took very little notice of them early on. Just thought they were some sort of anomaly, which he didn't know what they were, but he'd farm them and they'd go away. But when they had continued to appear, he decided that he'd better actually make a report of them and see if somebody could tell him what it was, because these things appearing regularly on his land were a bit of a nuisance. And that's exactly what he did. And as a result of it, a group of people, including people who were working with the British UFO Research Association in the area at the time, went there to have a look, take photographs, take samples, which were submitted to Bristol University for analysis for possible indications of radioactivity or any other changes to the composition, none of which on this occasion anyway were found, and so on and so forth. These are some of the photographs that were taken on that initial visit. This is the circle. We were not at that time, of course, in the techniques of having aerial photography. As you can see, it's a sort of typical single circle like many we're having now, with a somewhat irregular edge but it apparently had been there for some time when he called us in, we were able to go and photograph it. But there were very few people who've been out there. You can see there's little sign of any track damage or getting into it, or any real sign of how anybody got in there in the first place. It looked like a genuine anomaly. It was also sort of unusual as well, in that it wasn't just a circle. If I can find this wonder of technology that you can point things with, which is lurking under here somewhere. Here we are. This looks exactly like those things that the aliens carry in abduction cases. So if I point it in your direction, watch out. On this far right-hand edge of the circle, you can perhaps make out like a little wedge. This is in fact not an artifact of the camera or shadow or anything. It is exactly what was there. There was in fact a kind of chunk cut out of the circle. It had the first indications in the very first circle that started the whole thing off of linear markings, which I think is possibly something that is not well known but is obviously significant. Okay, so where did we go from there? We were not instantly convinced that this was evidence of a spaceship having crashed. There was nobody who had ever seen anything in association with it. There were no reports of UFOs or things of that description in the area at the time. But, of course, it was the way that the media regarded it. It was a very short-lived media interest thing. A local UFO enthusiast carried a story about it in which he did say that it was a UFO. There was some speculation about the UFO being invisible, and it sort of died a death from there on very quickly. From the start, there were really two theories as to what was going on that were popular within the public's mind. That's exemplified by this cartoon. For those of you who can't read it at the back, the statement at the bottom says, "Oi, get that thing out of here, I'm trying to make some corn circles." That's the farmer on his tractor telling the little green men to do that. And that was it, the stark choice right at the start. Either the crop circles are the result of ET landing, or the farmers who, for whatever reason, were doing it themselves. Now, this association between these marks and UFOs, which might seem a little odd because basically all it is a round hole in a field, there's nothing instantly to link it in with UFOs, has possibly a genesis as far back as 1966 in the Tully area of far north Queensland in Australia, where what were then called UFO nests were first noted. They appeared in a kind of swampland area called Horseshoe Lagoon. This is about 50 or 60 miles south of the town of Cairns. It's a fairly remote area. It's mostly rainforest. It's very swampy. And it's about as far removed from an English cornfield as you could possibly get. In addition to which, this circle that appeared was seen by one of the local farmers in direct association with a UFO. He saw this thing take off from this lagoon and rise up into the air. It was a kind of dome-shaped, oval-shaped, dark grey mass. And leave this circle of reeds, swirled in the similar way to the crop circles in corn, oats and whatever, floating on the surface of the water. They'd apparently been actually sucked up from the bottom of this lagoon and were now floating on the top. I think in this instance this is one case where we can be reasonably certain a hoax was not involved. Now, Doug and Dave, these two old codgers from England who said last year that they were responsible for a lot of the circles, which may or may not be true. I personally think they were responsible for some, but they certainly weren't responsible for all, and at the very most they were responsible for 10%. That's even the maximum they themselves claim. So they're a factor, but they're not a significant factor in the phenomenon. They actually said that they got the idea from these circles in the Tully area of Queensland because one of them was living in the area at the time. By wonderful irony, typical Fortean coincidence this, I was actually in Tully on the very day that the Doug and Dave story broke. I happened to be in Australia and I went up there to talk to the local people about what had been going on. It was interesting to discover that these circles had been appearing pretty regularly ever since 1966. They were not a one-off occurrence. It was something that happened and that the locals mostly just assumed to be an environmental factor. No one had a real explanation. I got all kinds of theories about what it was, just as you do if you talk to people now about circles in England. But there were very few of them who seemed to think they were anything to do with aliens. That was interesting. However, that was what brought the relationship between UFOs and these circular marks possibly to prominence anyway. Right from the start of those first circles in 1980, this chap got involved. He's Dr. Terence Meaden, who I have considerable respect for. I've known him now for quite a number of years, and I believe he's very sincerely tried to get to the truth about what is going on. He is, in a way, a meteorologist, but he's really a bit of a maverick meteorologist. He's not part of the mainstream, and he really is a physicist more than a meteorologist. He took to meteorology after he left his physics. And really what he does is he consults with various companies, power stations, things like that, in terms of how they might locate their buildings to minimize potential storm damage. Now, you might find it odd to believe, living here particularly, that tornadoes and whirlwinds are common in Britain, but they do happen. They're by no means as destructive as they are here, but of course any old tornado that happens to rip through a nuclear power station is not good news, so he did have something to do. He has an organisation called TORO, which is the Tornado and Storm Research Organisation, which is interested in all kinds of unusual vortex activity in the atmosphere. And he also edits a journal of meteorology, which is a very interesting magazine because it's different from the mainstream of meteorology. It takes account of unusual things. So you will often find in there stories about ball lightning, unusual holes in clouds and stuff like that. It's a kind of William Corliss type publication of meteorology. Now, he immediately assumed, looking at these circles, that they would fit into his field of work. They looked like something swirled on the ground. His philosophy was that they probably therefore came from the air, therefore the product was presumably swirling air. And he has gone through a series of metamorphoses of his phenomenon. It's the similar phenomenon which has changed slightly according to the way the evidence has developed. I personally have some reservations about the way he's been changing over the last few years. I think, unfortunately, as with many scientists who find themselves with a pet idea that they have devoted a lot of time to, they tend to go overboard with it. They tend to want to try and assume everything can be explained by it, and they tend to also react instantly to media judgments of it. And if something comes up which doesn't appear to fit, then rather than what I think they should have done, and that is sit, ponder, wait and see how things pan out, to instantly try and conjure up ways and means in which that new evidence can be made to fit the phenomenon. And I fear that he's been doing a little bit of that recently, and that might have led people to slightly move away from the basic hypothesis that he was proposing. I'll come back later on to more details about exactly what it was he was suggesting, but just bear in mind for the moment that his essential idea was that it was a rotating aerial force from the air, therefore, in that sense, a physical, natural part of our environment and not the product of any kind of alien intelligence. Okay, now before we were working with him from the start, we had seen no evidence of a direct link with UFOs. As it happens, I think at that time this was a premature conclusion, and I think we were wrong then, but at the time, based on the limited amount of evidence we had, that was a fair conclusion to have reached. This is a Bufora researcher called Paul Fuller, who became the Bufora officer who was most involved in crop circle research from about the mid-1980s onwards. He was very closely aligned with Dr. Meaden, still is, and is also now part of TORO as well as being part of Bufora. But one of the things he did, which was interesting and useful, and this was perhaps a fairly unique joint funded project between Bufora and TORO, so it was a kind of link between a science organisation and a UFO group, which was certainly unprecedented in Britain, and I don't suppose there have been all that many of them in America either, was that they decided to actually do a survey of all the farmers in one county. Paul is by profession a statistician. I'm glad I didn't have to say that last night at midnight. But statistician is what he does, and that means he has access to a lot of information and figures that this one county in England, Hampshire, which happens to be a place where a lot of circles have been forming, along with Wiltshire, those two adjacent counties are the areas where most of the circles over the past decade have been. And he was therefore able to basically get the information about all the cereal farmers in that county. So therefore be able to do a reasonably good statistical survey which that could be sent out to them, and they could then send information back telling us whether they'd had any circles in their land, what kind of circles they were, how far back into the past these had appeared, and things like what they personally thought these circles were. Now bear in mind this was happening in a period when we had now had about 5 or 6 years of circles, and they'd been appearing fairly sporadically, but with a small increase every year. They'd been and began small with 3 or 4 every summer, and they'd moved up to maybe 30 or 40 by the mid to the late 80s. But they were nothing like the kind of situation we've faced over the last 3 years. There was no big media interest. There had been no books about crop circles at this point. This was, therefore, to a large extent, uncontaminated data, and it was one of the last opportunities we actually had to get that, because once the media discovered circles and the public discovered circles, then it changed beyond all recognition, because, of course, that it becomes a part of the phenomenon when it becomes a huge sociological thing. The results of his survey were pretty interesting. What it found effectively was that farmers more or less split down the middle in terms of whether they thought these were hoaxes or whether they thought that they were produced by some sort of a weather effect. There were a couple of people who suggested that they were produced by some kind of intelligence, but that was pretty limited. And also, there were quite a number of circles that came forward which had not been reported before, including some types which hadn't been reported before as well. So we found new data from that, and we began to realise that farmers were not reporting circles all the time. Many of them had woken up to the fact already that it isn't the circle that does the damage, it's all the sightseers who go trampling all over their fields that do. The circle itself doesn't usually destroy the crop, it can still be harvested, so they don't lose any money. But if you have 5,000 people walking through your field, that does. So it was very quick for them to spot that fact, and therefore circle reporting has always been a problem, and you have to win the confidence of the farming community too. Okay, so essentially at that point we still had no reason to believe that the crop circle phenomenon was any big deal, but there were hints beginning to appear that the circles were getting a little bit out of hand in terms of the basic theory that Terence Meaden had, that this was effectively just some swirling air from the sky which was producing them. At this point, Bufora produced what was probably the first publication about crop circles called Mystery of the Circles, which Paul Fuller and I edited in 1986, and which was surprising to us because we didn't realise how much interest there was in crop circles. We were just doing this as a sort of very much a side issue of Bufora research, but a lot of people were interested, they wanted to know. We actually had 2 debates in London in which we invited all the aspects of the crop circle community to come together. And it was probably the first and the last time when everybody did that. Terence Meaden, Colin Andrews, Pat Delgado, Busty Taylor, all the figures in the field who were around then in 1986 and 1987 came, gave their talks, presented their ideas, and we all debated it in a friendly way. And the media were invited, and about 2 turned up, because there was nobody interested in crop circles then. If that had have happened 2 or 3 years later, we wouldn't have had a room big enough to fit everybody in, and they'd probably also been strangling one another in the process, the way things eventually did begin to get out of hand. Okay, so we eventually updated that publication into this one, summarising Bufora's view of the crop circles circa about 1988, which, as you can see, was not taking them all that seriously. This was a publication which, again, we just produced as our own little thing in-house, no big deal, and we were astonished at the interest. This has actually sold more copies than anything Bufora has ever produced. It went through 8 reprints in about the first year, and that was just because suddenly, around the time when it appeared, the crop circle phenomenon took off, thanks to the fact that Colin Andrews and Pat Delgado published their book Circular Evidence the same summer. And instantly it became the in thing to do. It was the hot subject of the paranormal world. Okay, so the theory was working insofar as simple crop circles were concerned. At least we had relative confidence that it was. What they were saying was that it was just some rotating air from the sky, and if you've got a circle like this, you can begin to see ways and means why that might work. And yes, you have problems. You've got the linear edges, which look very sharply defined, as if a cookie cutter has come down from the sky. It's possibly hard to imagine how that can relate to the sort of usual trails of destruction you see from a tornado or a whirlwind. But Dr. Meaden and his colleagues had ideas, had answers, and had suggestions, and we were not meteorologists or physicists, we were UFO researchers, and they made sense to us. We were not really in a position to comment. And at that stage, we were certainly prepared to accommodate what it was that he was having to say. But by this point, the mid-1980s to the late 1980s, things were certainly gradually changing. We were having not just formations like that, which do appear to be, from the air, swirled patterns in the ground, but we were having things with rings round them and straight lines coming out of them. Notice how that little spur, making it look like a spyglass or an eyeglass, goes right along the tram lines. Now the tram lines are those sort of parallel lines that you can see across there, which are what the farmers use to move up and down in their vehicles, so they don't sort of literally go all over the field throughout the summer and wreck the whole field. They can follow those tracks and limit the damage that they do to the crop. But it's also, of course, a perfect way of getting in and out of the field, if you're of a mind to be mischievous and hoax circles. You could have argued that that was the perfect way to fake that straight line, that, you know, all you had to do was use the tram lines as guides and plough along it with whatever you were going to use to fake it. Terence Meaden argued that it was a sort of line of least resistance for the wind effect, and when it hit the ground and sort of splurged out sideways, it followed along the tram lines. You know, you could take either hypothesis as being valid. It certainly wasn't out of the question that what he was saying was valid. But things were gradually getting more and more complex. We had, even by as early as 1983, quintuplet formations, which is basically what this is. It's sort of one large central circle and 4 small satellites on the outside. This is one that appeared near Warminster, a place called Upton Scudamore. Not only have you got this sort of quintuplet formation, but you've also got rings round. You can only see one on that particular reproduction of the picture, but there are actually several rings round that formation. And also, if you look at the other parts of the field, you can find little circles scattered around in different spots outside the main formation. So it was a field which was sort of growing circles all the time, because they didn't all appear apparently at the same point. It seemed to be attracting circles. This was a fairly remote field. It was difficult to spot. You couldn't see any of this from the ground. The only way you could have discovered these circles was from the air. I went in there myself, and it took a long time to actually get into it. And you had to know where you were going. And of course you had to have the farmer's permission as well. Okay, now that's how things stood around about the time when circular evidence was produced. And when that was produced, and the phenomenon suddenly went big, in a big way, also the phenomenon changed markedly. It had definitely been gradually evolving, but there were ways and means in which you could accommodate that. You could argue, for example, that because you were slowly attracting more people to be interested in them, farmers were becoming more aware of what was going on. There were now occasional media stories about it, that inevitably you were going to discover more circles. Also, more people were looking from them from the air, which is the easiest place to find them, so inevitably that too was going to produce more examples of circles. So you could accommodate the increase in numbers from 3 or 4 to 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 over a period of a few years. But in 1989, in the wake of circular evidence, the phenomenon went haywire. We started to get hundreds of circles, and we started to get circles of incredibly complex design. There's Colin Andrews in the days before circular evidence, in one of the circles which he was working on with before at the time. At the centre, where you can see the sort of swirl pattern that forms also in the side there, in the centre of a circle, giving you this lovely sort of Catherine wheel type effect. Beautiful rotational forces, intricate design, and it's the beauty of them, of course, which has captured the attention of most people. They don't look like they could be done by nature. But then again, bear in mind, there are many things in nature which have beautiful designs. Snowflakes, for instance, if you look at them under a microscope, have lovely, beautiful geometric patterns. So we shouldn't rule out of court the possibility that apparently pretty geometric designs can be formed by nature. Okay, what we were worried about with Imbuphora, once Colin and others came out with their ideas first of all in a magazine called Flying Saucer Review, which is a popular UFO journal in Britain, and later in their books and through the crop circle societies that were formed in the wake of 1989 and 1990, was that their argument that this had to be an alien intelligence that was doing this. Now, as I said right at the start, I'm not opposed at all to the possibility that that could be true. But I do think it's premature to reach that conclusion without having explored the other possibilities thoroughly first. Excuse me. I got any water here, or are these just cups? Oh. I have to magic the water, do I? Okay. Oh, right, thank you. Thank you very much, yes. So this is what we were particularly worried about at Bufora, this possibility that the idea that they were alien, was a premature conclusion that needed more application of thought. And one of the reasons, well, several of the reasons really, why we argued for caution was that we had been spending some time looking to see whether or not there was a historical precedent for the crop circles. If Dr. Meaden was right, and this was a natural phenomenon don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. I mean, it would be highly unlikely that suddenly in 1980 circles would start to appear and then they would begin to get more commonplace and so on. There were in fact very good reasons, which Dr. Meaden rarely talked about, which we could see, which could make that happen. Thank you. For instance, that the changes in the atmosphere produced by the hole in the ozone layer, or the depletion of the atmosphere, certain boundary layers there, could have had an effect on any process that goes on in this layer between the atmosphere and the Earth. Also, there were changes that were occurring in cropping patterns too. We were using more and more effective types of pesticide, which were causing the crops to become more resistant. And therefore, possibly we had a situation where some kind of boundary had suddenly been crossed, and a whole combination of these effects may have come together. And suddenly, something which was relatively rare in the past, and only when the right combination of circumstances were reproduced did it produce a circle, was now happening more and more often. When the right environmental conditions met the right conditions on the ground, and lo and behold, a circle formed. Yes, okay. But nevertheless, we thought it would be useful to look back into the past and see what we could find. And we did, and we found circles, not only from about 30 different countries, had been reported extensively throughout the literature if you looked hard enough, of what superficially at least, and it was difficult to be sure in many of these cases, resembled the things that we were seeing now. But also, we found cases going far back into the past. We now have a database of about 120 circles pre-1980. So it isn't just sort of isolated events like that one at Evenlode. There are now quite a few. There is no doubt at all that the phenomenon is more common now than it was before, or at least is more commonly reported, but I think probably more common as well as more commonly reported. But nevertheless, it was around, and we have some pretty good anecdotal admitted reports, because there can't really be very much else from this far back in the past, of circles appearing in the early part of this century and in the latter part of the last century. We have some farmers who are quite adamant that they've told us that these circles have been on their land on and off every year more or less for 40 or 50 years in their father's time and their grandfather's time and so on. Also, what we also found was that if you looked at the way that the circles were distributed in Britain, other than in the counties of Hampshire and Wiltshire, which we call Wessex, where these circles were appearing during the 1980s, we found that before the 1980s they weren't appearing there. In fact, occasional ones were, but they were appearing pretty randomly scattered throughout the rest of the country. We had circle events from Devon, we had one from Gloucestershire, which I mentioned before, we had them from Cheshire, which is 200 or 300 miles further north. They were literally scattered. Obviously going to focus their actions on the area where the researchers were and where the cameras were. So that was another reason why a lot of more circles might start to appear in Hampshire and Wiltshire. Not substantive proof, of course, of what we were arguing, but sufficient proof, we felt, to suggest that this conclusion which was reached very early on, that an intelligence was trying to tell us something, was at least perhaps a little premature. There are also what you might call pseudo-circles that appear, circles that look impressive at first sight, but are actually no such thing. This is a circle which you could see if you passed down a very busy motorway. It's actually the one I mentioned briefly last night that appeared in the dip, where the road dips literally, by the army base at Burton Wood, the US Army base there. It appeared in a field. The army base is literally behind your back as you're looking at that photograph now, and the runway is effectively just across the other side of the road. That's the view you initially saw. I went round the back. There's nothing but fields for a couple of miles round the back there. Found the farmer. He had no idea that this circle was there. He was puzzled and intrigued. And in fact, we went out on his tractor and then went in to the field along the tram lines, which took quite a long time to get to because it was way over the far side from where the farmhouse was. But of course, as you can see, it's near this fence at the front, which is actually the boundary fence to the motorway. So anybody wanting to get in from there, if they wanted to hoax it, could have got over there very quickly. But there are no signs of any tracks there, and there were no tram lines from this side either that they could have gone along. So hoaxing was never really a likely option. When you actually get closer in, you'll see that it superficially resembles a circle. I mean, it's got the same round shape, the sort of standing up edges. It's a bit of a mess, yes, but this was very early on. This was in May of 1990, and therefore the crop was very green, and that's a not untypical appearance for early summer circles. However, when you actually get right into the circle, you'll see it actually is not at all like a crop circle. It's very ragged around the edges. There is bits of crop growing in the middle, but a lot of it is just bare earth and denuded. And after consideration with the farmer, although he couldn't be sure, his belief was that this in fact was a product of overwatering of the ground. He'd had some problems with this side of the field. He had put a lot of water on. He'd noticed that there'd been some excess surface water in the area, not in this particular exact area, but in other parts of the field nearby. And that was his proposition as to what had gone on. Obviously, we can't prove it, but it's just to illustrate that there are ways and means in which pseudo-circles, or things that look like circles, may appear under other circumstances and may not necessarily relate to crop circles as we know them. That's true of things like fairy rings. We get an awful lot of people who report to us fairy rings as crop circles. They're no such thing. They're widely acknowledged to be produced by fungus and mould growing in the ground, which just causes literally a ring of slightly darkened grass. They usually appear in grass rather than crop fields. And they can be recognised. And there are lots of things like that which can produce effects which may fool people at first glance. It's a bit like UFOs. There are misperceptions as well as genuine UFOs. I think there are less misperceptions of crop circles than there are of UFOs. The majority of what we're seeing are genuine circles, whatever genuine circles are. But we do have to watch out for these options as well. Another early idea as to what was producing crop circles was that helicopters were doing it. I remember in one case in the Midlands of England, the farmer told me quite categorically that he knows what had done the circle because he saw a helicopter producing a circle in an adjacent field the summer before. Unfortunately, whatever he says he saw, as far as we can ascertain, that's impossible. There's a sort of picture from a TV stunt where they tried to reproduce a circle at our suggestion in a field. It's since been duplicated by another television programme with a different type of helicopter and a different type of crop, and on both occasions all you get is a mess. The downblast produces that. Someone did suggest to us who flies helicopters that they probably could do it if they could fly the helicopter upside down, but they weren't prepared to try. More interestingly than that, Lieutenant Colonel Edgecombe was actually asked by the Ministry of Defence in the mid-1980s to prepare a report for them on whether or not helicopters were producing crop circles. His job was to actually assess claims from farmers for damage to their fields by the many helicopters that fly in and around the many military establishments in the areas around Hampshire and Wiltshire where these circles were appearing. So he did his job, and he very quickly established that that was impossible. He kindly gave us a copy of his report, which we published in Mystery of the Circles, and it basically said, we don't know what these things are, but they're definitely not anything down to us. So we could rule out helicopters, even though you still hear that argument trotted out from time to time. But it was not so simple to get rid of hoaxing. Hoaxing has definitely been a problem from the very earliest days. Doug and Dave not taken into account at all. The very first hoax we know of for certain happened in July of 1983, when the then most complex formation, a quintuplet, that one big ring with 5 around the outside edge, was actually faked in under an hour by a group of people who were paid to do so by one national newspaper in Britain, who was peeved at another national newspaper having got all the publicity that summer. So they decided to fake this circle, let them present it as real, and then expose them and say, you silly fools. Unfortunately, that newspaper had lost all interest in UFOs by this time, because it was not the big subject then that it is now, and they just never ever even bothered to report the circle. So the existence of the hoax sat unidentified for quite a long time, and unfortunately a couple of quite well-known crop circle researchers around then did make public statements to the effect that they thought this formation was real. We were able to get the newspaper to publicly admit the fake, and also some of the people who were involved in creating it for them a couple of years later, so we do know it was a definite hoax. So again, you had right from the start this worry at the back of your mind as to whether it was as easy as it seemed to tell the difference between real circles and fake circles. This is another attempt to hoax a circle. Not a bad one, it's a fairly small circle. They did it in a few minutes, and there's quite a few of them, as you can see, by basically rolling around on the floor. You can do it. You can do it by putting a pole in the centre, having a piece of rope, and moving that stealthily in a circle, and flattening the crop gently. Others have become a bit more sophisticated. We've had techniques where people have actually used big polystyrene foam blocks so that they act a bit like snowshoes, and they spread the load. Therefore you don't get the downward crushing pressure that you would get from human feet, just as you do with these huge wide snowshoes. It spreads the load over a large area, and it has less damage effect on the crop, but it still produces this nice squashy, gentle, flattened pattern. So hoaxing is feasible, but of course it's feasible when you're dealing with a few hoaxers of relatively small scale and with not a lot of people snooping around. Hoaxing on a grand scale gets more and more difficult when you've got lots of circles of very complex designs appearing in an area where there are hundreds of people and lots of cameras and monitors and goodness knows what watching at the same time. So I am not for one moment attempting to suggest to you that hoaxing is the explanation to the crop circle phenomenon, only giving you these warnings that hoaxing has been going on for at least 10 years and therefore is clearly a factor in the equation, which I think we've underestimated in the past, which is why I'm therefore not surprised about Duggan Day's revelations, not unprepared to accept that they have produced even 100 circles like they claim they may have done. It's not outside the bounds of possibility at all, in my view. Of course, the problem got immensely more complicated still when the media got involved in a big way in 1989, because things like this started to happen. We'll pay you £10,000, that's about $17,000, if you can solve the crop circle mystery. And a few people thought, wow, if I can show I can fake a circle that will fool people, I'll have solved the mystery and I'd be $17,000 richer. About 3 of these competitions were actually started up by rival establishments. So for a time, certainly during 1989 and into 1990, it was pretty lucrative for those who might have had at the back of their minds the idea of hoaxing. So it's quite conceivable that a number of long-term hoax experiments were started around that time by goodness knows who, for goodness knows whatever motivations, who thought they could come up with something clever and try and win the money. So remember, bear that in mind. In fact, I've just actually closed down a competition. I was one of the judges for one of these £10,000 competitions, and over the past couple of years they've sent me hundreds and hundreds of letters of entries from people who have one theory or another that they have proposed to try and explain what's going on. And quite a few of those were my hoax technique, including some quite avant-garde hoax techniques. You know, I can do it with a garden roller or a mower. Well, that's all that's necessary. Unfortunately, that's one of the worst methods to use. It doesn't work. It produces a mess usually, but if you're careful enough, you can try. Someone else who suggested that he actually walked into the field in the middle of the night, where it's usually pitch dark and there are no lights, remember, on stilts, to produce these circles. Well, I for one certainly like to see him do that. As far as I know, he hasn't given a demonstration. Maybe he's not got out of hospital yet. Let's look at an anatomy, if you like, of a hoax. A typical hoax, if you look hard enough, does give you clues. You can see patterns like this at the exact swirl centre where there's a bare hole. That's usually an indication, I've found, that that's where the pole went, if they're not very clever at covering up their tracks. That is the centre of a definite hoax, which was suspected, eventually admitted, to have been created by a UFO buff, who wanted to get some local publicity for a UFO society. That's as far as I'll say on there, otherwise I'll probably get sued. But he has admitted that privately, but not publicly. That is, in fact, what took place in this incident. This is, you can't see it very well, but this is, in fact, a very interesting case. This is a ring which formed at a place called Lower Pever in Cheshire. It's actually spelt P over, but you can perhaps tell why, therefore, the local people call it Pever. They found this ring there. That's the ring in the field, in a sort of little slight bowl depression. These lines here are the tram lines going through the field. Now, that's all you see from the outside. This is actually not far at all from Jodrell Bank, the big radio telescope place. And in fact, if you actually stand on that tree there, about halfway up, and look in this direction, you can actually see the Jodrell Bank, a huge dish. So anybody who might have been thinking of hoaxing put this in a pretty ideal place. Now, the gate into the field is here at this corner, and the tram lines start here. When I got there very early on, fortunately, before this became a big media fuss, it was actually presented as the first crop circle in Cheshire, which is totally untrue. At that point, we already had a database of about 20 circles in Cheshire. But no matter, that's what the media wanted to promote it as. They wanted to make a big deal. That's fair enough. This is actually the summer before last when this happened. Everybody was saying it cannot be a hoax because there were no tracks from the gate to the first tram line. It was virgin soil, virgin crop, no footprints, no evidence, and it was too far for them to jump. I suppose the guy on his stilts might have found a way of doing it, I don't know, but effectively that seemed to rule things out. The circle itself, the ring rather, was not very good. It was pretty much a mess, as you can see, ragged and not exactly at all indicative of the kind of real things we get. But nevertheless, it was still thought to be genuine by a lot of people. On the very night that I took those photographs, 2 UFO investigators appeared on television pronouncing it as genuine, and evidence that an alien invasion which had formerly centred on Hampshire and Wiltshire was now heading north, and that they were gradually mapping out the country. I wasn't quaking in my boots at that point because I'd already made up my mind about this particular case. But nevertheless, it does show you again this fairly endemic rush to judgment about cases. This is from the ring looking back the other way, and this is what people actually didn't do, and what I would urge people who are investigating crop circles to spend a bit more time doing. And that is, think about the less obvious ways in which hoaxers might have been. If you follow the tram lines directly from the ring all the way back across the field to the other side, you actually come to a public footpath where there is masses of damage, where people have gone through hedges and milled around on a grass verge there, because there's no way of saying that wasn't just people walking down the footpath, but there's also no way of saying that it wasn't the way that the hoaxers got in. The point I'm making is that by not seeing any damage in the obvious route down at this bottom corner of the field, not even thinking that there was another way of getting to the circle, a jump to conclusions was made, and it's dangerous to do that. This is the centre of the ring where, in fact, the pole that was used, I believe, to demark the circle. I say believe here because this is a suspected hoax. No one has come forward to admit they did it. And you can see the sort of hole in the ground, which was quite effectively covered up, in fact. This is something else I recommend investigators to do. There was, in fact, a sort of covering of loose sods of earth placed over the hole, which had been removed. Probably, I couldn't find where they'd been removed from, and they'd probably been removed from somewhere else further away in the field and carefully deposited over the hole to hide the telltale evidence. So that's another thing to watch out for. So in other words, if you're careful enough, you can sometimes find evidence to explain in more mundane terms things which at first glance look to be more significant than they are. Of course, in this instance, we have direct proof at last that the aliens did do it. There is an alien in the ring, which I confronted the minute I got there. I thought, this is it, wonderful. This is going to be on the newspapers all over the world tomorrow. I have final proof that the aliens have created rings. They obviously abducted these people who were not very happy about the fact that I was wandering along the tram line into their ring. In fact, what this turned out to be, as you'll see here, is our wonderful British media and their highly objective presentation of the UFO phenomenon and their idea of what a serious presentation means. They had dressed up this guy in a suit and had him literally running around the ring, waving his arms up and down in the air. And then they took him along to a local university where they interviewed 2 professors, asking them what they thought it was. And in the midst of this, they brought this alien in and said some derogatory things and then walked out with the cameras, leaving these 2 poor professors stood there looking rather startled and wondering why they'd been set up. This is unfortunately typical of the kind of way the media play, not only on the crop circle phenomenon, but on the UFO phenomenon too. They cannot treat it in a serious way. They have to make a joke about it. Now, although in the personal investigations that I've carried out in mostly in northern England, which involves about 24 circles, my own figures suggest that approximately 2/3 of them, as high as that, are probably hoaxed. Now that's a lot higher than the figures you're getting from people down in Hampshire and Wiltshire. I personally suspect it's because they're not looking hard enough for hoaxes. There are mitigating circumstances. I'm lucky in the sense that where I live, I cover an area of a few counties. Circles are not appearing every other day. You know, I'm lucky if there's 3 or 4 a summer in the area where I live. So I have plenty of time to do this kind of thing. Whereas if you're down Hampshire and Wiltshire, there's sometimes at the height of the summer circles appearing several times a day, and certainly particularly at weekends, because they do seem to have a fondness for appearing at weekends too. That's another little clue. There's lots and lots of them. So obviously, you know, it is very difficult to do intensive investigations of every single circle. Accepted. But even on my figures of 2/3 of the circles being hoaxed, that still leaves 1/3 that aren't. 1/3 of the ones that I've personally seen, that I'm satisfied are probably not the product of any kind of human action at all. So I'm certainly not suggesting that the crop circle phenomenon is explained away as hoaxes. That one is, I think. In fact, we've had a couple of messages like that that have been presented. There was one a few years ago, which is quite well known, where the aliens are supposedly spelt out in a field, "We are not alone." What always baffled me about this was why those who took it seriously never figured out the semantic problems of that. If the aliens were writing this message, why didn't they say, "You are not alone"? Maybe this is direct evidence of the hybrid experiments, of course. I only just thought of that. The Mandelbrot that was talked about before, now I can't prove to you that that was a hoax, but I do have to say a couple of mitigating things about it, and that is that shortly before that Mandelbrot formation appeared, there was in fact a letter in New Scientist magazine suggesting that a Mandelbrot formation would appear. Now, maybe the aliens saw that and took note, or maybe somebody else did. It wasn't far away from Cambridge University, and Arthur C. Clarke has told both me and, as I found out a few days ago when I talked to him, John McNeish independently, that's the producer of Crop Circle Communique, and apparently to his satisfaction, so he told me, that he knew who at Cambridge University had actually hoaxed that formation. So I would recommend caution, at least in that sense. And it is another indication of what looks at first glance to be evidence of an intelligence doesn't necessarily mean an intelligence from up there. There is an argument, I'm not sure it's proven yet, that there is actually intelligence on Earth, in which case that's something you have to take into account. But that's a hoax circle there on the bottom right. There's the sort of classic hole that I've found in quite a number of them that indicate a hoax. Up at the top left there, that isn't. That's one of the cases I've investigated which I'm personally, at this point in time, prepared to be convinced otherwise, but so far haven't been, is genuine. It's a simple single circle in a field of winter wheat, formed late in the summer before last in 1990, in Cheshire, a place called Preston Brook. And it was, to me, very impressive indeed for a whole host of reasons. The swirl pattern in the centre was quite remarkable. It had this beautiful intricate layering design to it, which I had not seen before in any of the circles I've actually studied, but I gather a couple of other researchers have found in a couple of other circles. And it is also in a very remarkable area. It's an area which is absolutely rife with paranormal phenomena. It's one of John Keel's window areas, beyond any shadow of a doubt. I've done quite a lot of research into the background of this location, and even I was surprised at the number of things I found in and around this location. For instance, There are literally oodles of car stop cases in the area, cars that have suddenly stopped for no reason. We have several instances of time lapses. People have lost periods of time. In none of them have they been subjected to regression hypnosis. Who knows what would have happened if they had, but they are sort of indications of possible pre-abduction situations anyway. We have lots of sightings of UFOs. We have a wonderful poltergeist case where a very famous TV weatherman in Great Britain, by irony, I presume, unless there is a cosmic spirit up there which loves to play practical jokes, but he was a weatherman. He was actually on a barge filming some non-related programme for television, travelling the canals of northern England, going through a tunnel when this very strange effect, he described it as like a strange suction effect, but it got popularised by the media as a poltergeist, literally sucked what was described again by the local newspaper as a can of baked beans, which allowed them to make all kinds of jokes about the wind, being sucked up into the air on its own volition. In actual fact, when I talked to him, he told me that it was really a can of beer, but they decided to hide that fact from the newspapers because that would have indicated to the newspapers that they were probably drunk at the time, which he assured me they weren't. This, in fact, happened inside a tunnel, which I didn't know at the time when I investigated this case, because I investigated that case about a year before the crop circle appeared. But in actual fact, the tunnel goes right underneath the adjacent field on the same land owned by the same farmer as this crop circle appeared upon. In addition to this, and this is even more incredible, 2 abduction cases have happened within 1 mile of this crop circle. One of them happened, and this is even more staggering, about as close as you could get to that crop circle without actually being in the field. I actually measured it, and it was about 350 yards from the centre of the circle an abduction case happened. That is absolutely astonishing. I don't know what the odds or coincidences are for that, because I certainly only know of about 40 abduction cases in Great Britain, and that one of them should happen that close to a crop circle is pushing it a bit. In addition to this, there's a famous contactee case from the 1950s, which happened only a couple of miles away from here. A chap who met aliens from the planet Zomdick. You'll probably find it if you look through some of the old 1950s literature. But there are case after case after case like this. I mean, I've only scratched the surface in this brief introduction to it there. Interestingly too, the picture I showed you last night of the guy who saw this figure coming down the embankment and wandering in front of his car, although that isn't in the immediate area of where the circle was, it actually isn't very far away at all, certainly close enough to be too close for comfort. I didn't tell you last night that there was an awful lot of dimensions to this case which I didn't go into, most notably of which was that this guy actually died, while still very young, from multiple cancers which he contracted in the months following this being struck by these beams of light coming out of this. But even more interesting, and I only decided to re-include this photograph after listening to Linda this morning, is that when we were investigating the site, a couple of days after the incident had occurred, at the exact spot where this figure had come down the embankment, we found on the grass verge there a rabbit which had a hole in it. No blood, no indication of it having been struck by a car or anything. At the time, I blush, we did very little about it. This is going back to 1978, so we did have animal mutilations were unheard of in Great Britain then. We didn't take any notice of it at all, but we did record it. We did make a record of the fact. It is, in fact, in the article we wrote about the case in Flying Saucer Review at the time, so we prove we're not retrospectively inventing this. But whether or not that is pure coincidence or not, I don't know, but it was important that I should mention that in view of what Linda said. So really, we're faced with a situation here of trying to figure out what is going on here. I think that from what I've said, I hope you'll agree, certainly I'm satisfied, that the original premise that Bufora had right at the start of our investigations, that there was no relationship between crop circles and UFOs, has now been shown to be inaccurate. We were as guilty of premature judgment as I'm now accusing others of being today. I accept that, absolutely. There is, in my opinion, a relationship between crop circles and UFOs. I don't know what that relationship is, but it's there. Now, there are so many ideas about what crop circles are. Oh, I have missed something very important out, which I'll mention. You remember the cage that Linda was telling you about in the abduction case? This is an incident where some people were poaching by the side of a river. Then they saw this object come down, and these small entities get out, produce that cage. In actual fact, although this is an artistic reproduction which was produced for my report to Flying Saucer Review, the witness testimony says that the cage was slightly larger than that. What they did with that cage was they actually took it to some immobilized and apparently paralyzed cows that were standing in the field right by where this object had come down, and they used it not to apparently capture the cows, but to move the bars and the frames up and down as if they were taking measurements and dimensions of it. This incident happened in January of 1978. It happened only, in fact, 6 weeks prior to the other incident that I've just told you about, and only a few miles away. This, in fact, happened at a place called Devil's Garden, where, again, I found from researching the folklore and history of the area, there are masses of strange phenomena, events associated with it. This happened 2 miles from where that classic swirl crop circle at Preston Brook was that I told you before. It's yet another case in this extraordinary window area where these phenomena are occurring. Another indication that we just cannot ignore this apparent relationship. So what are the ideas that people are coming up with? As I said before, I've seen hundreds of them from this competition, the £10,000 competition, which eventually was decided not to award anybody anything by the newspaper because they concluded that nobody had actually proved what the phenomenon was. But ideas have ranged from demented hedgehogs running around in circles, which I was one of the early ones I think we could effectively rule out. One of my favourites is a theory that somebody came up with, that German bombs from World War II, which had been dropped when the bombers were fleeing back to Germany, had sunk deep into the ground, and over the decades their chemicals had begun to corrode away and they react with one another, and now they were exploding deep underground, one after the other, in a chain reaction, producing the circles on the ground. Absolute nonsense, of course, but it was a wonderfully clever idea. Perhaps my favourite, though, was... oh, there's another theory, yes. This is the sort of cartoon imagery that we're getting now. The comment at the bottom says, well, I think we can rule out unusual activity by the sun, which if anybody's been to Britain in the summer, you'll know why that's a particularly apt description. But I think my favourite theory that someone came up with was that these sort of little marks and images that are beginning to appear in fields are the result of aircraft toilets. Literally what happens is when you flush the chain, if you're flying overhead, the contents of the lavatory falls down from the sky and freezes high up in the atmosphere. It goes plop down into the field in the middle of the night, marks out this depression. Of course, as the sun rises, it gets warmer, it melts, and it sinks into the ground, so you never see any sign of this, and lo and behold, you've got this wonderful circle apparently formed out of nowhere. My impression is this is a wonderful way of explaining crap circles, but I don't think it actually works in this instance anyway. As you can see, by 1989 and 1990, when the publicity had begun and everybody was now looking for circles, we were starting to get these very strange geometric shapes and designs, quite different from what we were getting prior to 1989. That is obviously significant. You can't divorce it from the fact that the change in sociology as caused by the massive publicity and the massive amount of people out there looking, and obviously the amount of people who were trying to win the money or who were trying to hoax things for different motivations, had some effect on what was going on. But whether it was a real change in the phenomenon or a response to that, it was definitely a change, and we were getting all kinds of complex shapes. I'll just show you a couple because I'm sure that George is going to have plenty of more recent weird and wonderful patterns to show you in the next part of the presentation. You know, the famous pictograms, so-called, or agroglyphs or something. I think they've reinvented a name for them recently, which I'm quite prepared to go on record and state absolutely, in my opinion, are not the product of any kind of meteorological force. Dr. Meaden did try, valiantly, but in my view foolishly, to find a way of changing his theory to accommodate these. I think if you had been able to step back and look at these with any kind of a rationalist eye, which wasn't desperately trying to make your theory work, you would have seen that the best thing to do was to either forget your theory or find a way of demonstrating that these circles are hoaxes, because that was the only realistic alternative at this point in time. If these circles are not hoaxes, then, as far as I'm concerned, they are the product of something much more bizarre than any kind of meteorological force. I personally think that's self-evident. I don't see how anybody could conclude anything different. But nevertheless, for the record, I think it's only fair that that actually be stated. There's just another sort of view of the kind of long drawn-out formation that we have in these fields. The argument was, of course, for them against them being hoaxes, that this would take a long time to produce. But in real terms, when you bear in mind the five-circle formation that was formed as early as 1983 by a hoax, it's not really impossible. It's a question of man-hours, I suppose. If you have enough people out there in the field doing it, you can do it in a relatively short space of time. So that isn't itself an argument against the size or complexity of a formation. Although perhaps demarking a complex formation at night without any artificial lighting, as you can see, there are no lights for anywhere for miles around there, so you would have a tough job in the dark producing something like that. It does become a problem. This is a very good book about crop circles, a sort of edited compilation of different views and opinions of what went on, edited by Ralph Noyes, who again was mentioned last night in terms of the Bentwaters case, but is now very deeply interested in crop circles. The reason I show this is simply because of an interesting report that came from a member of the Army Signals Corps, who tells us of an experiment that he says he was involved in about 20 or 30 years ago. I forget the exact date at the moment. But the point is that what he says they did was they went into a field, a cereal field, and they placed this high-frequency radio mast in the field. And they were told not to go into that field. It was dangerous to do so. And the following morning, they went into the field to dismantle the equipment, and marked out around the mast was a circle, but not just an ordinary circle, a quartered circle like that. And the quarters had actually followed the strut lines of the guy ropes, or the pole structure that was holding up the mast. And he thought that obviously what had happened was some radiation which was being generated by whatever this experimental equipment was that they were using had obviously followed the lines of these struts and produced this quartered circle effect. Now, that may be a fabrication. I have no reason to think it is, not from the conversations I've had with the person involved. It may have nothing whatsoever to do with the crop circle phenomenon as we now know it today. Or it may well be that whatever energy force was involved then is involved in whatever is producing the circles now. We just don't know, but it's an anecdote which was worth pointing out under the circumstances. As I said before, hoaxes are an intelligence, apparently, of some kind of intelligence anyway. I mean, the amount of destruction they do, it does make you wonder. But you do have to remember the possibility, always, that they could somehow be responsible. And we've had all kinds of different groups of people doing this, not just Doug and Dave, two old artists who sort of decided to make a name for themselves by playing a little game, they claim, with the crop circle researchers and Dr. Meaden, and initially with the UFO groups. This is what they say. This is how it all started off. But we've also had quite a number of people who've been caught and arrested for hoaxing circles. That's something to bear in mind. Usually they're young children or teenagers. But there have been quite a number of instances of young farmers. That's a sort of social club for farmers who usually enjoy a lot of boozing, and afterwards, maybe a little bit worse for wear, go out into a field and produce results. And there have been some which have been attributed to them. Skeptics groups, like your PsyCop, have got in on the act too, decided to make circles to try and catch out serious researchers. Pub landlords, a couple of instances we have fairly reasonable grounds for believing, have had something to do with the fact that circles magically appear quite near their pubs on a regular basis, with considerable increase in their takings. A couple of agricultural colleges have had a battle with one another. This happened last summer, where they basically had a competition to see who could fake the most imaginative circle, and a number of last year's circles were the result of that. Students at universities in a number of instances too. So there are now a whole group of people from different reasons and different motivations who are involved in this hoaxing game. So this is always a factor, and it's an increasingly serious factor, which we have to remember. That said, I personally believe that there is something more than hoaxing going on. I have to say that you can, at times, perhaps, reach conclusions which are not valid. Take this, for instance. I mean, it's difficult. I'm just trying to think of a right way to show you this, where it works. This looks like a beautifully complex Celtic cross type formation with the cross and the handle. I've heard it described to me as that on a couple of occasions. Whereas if you actually look at it, what you've really got is one of two things. You've either got a quintuplet formation, that's the main central circle and the four spaced around it, and this one circle which just happens to be on its own. Or you've got someone who was trying to produce, by hoax methods, a sort of Celtic cross type formation and got slightly out in their calculations. Because if you follow the straight line through these circles, you'll see it doesn't go through the other one. It is not a straight line at all. That one is slightly out of place. So the eye tends to deceive itself at times. We look for patterns in phenomena that aren't there. I'm not suggesting that every single example of so-called Celtic cross formations isn't a Celtic cross, but I am showing you the dangers of assuming that a pattern is a pattern, and that a pattern that is a pattern has to therefore have some kind of exotic explanation. Terence Meaden's theory, I'll go back to it now and tell you a little bit more about what he thought, works well when you're dealing with single circles like this. Now, prior to the summer of 1989, in fact, I think probably prior to the summer of 1990, because there were very few of these complex formations even in the summer of 1989. Prior to the summer of 1990, approximately 90 to 95% of all crop circles were like this. They were simple, single circles. They were not the fantastic patterns you've seen dominating all the pictures and images and so on. Now, that has to be taken into account. You can't just ignore the fact that for 10 of the 12 years of our knowledge of crop circles, this is what we were getting, not the things that you're seeing now. Obviously, something has changed, but it's changed relatively recently. More than that, what we've also got is, if we look at the evidence of the circles pre-1980, none of them are complex formations. They are all pretty simple ones. Something else you might not realise, but there are actually about 30 instances of eyewitnesses who've seen crop circles form before their very eyes. They've stood in a field when it's happened. In all those instances, as far as I can tell, I don't know of any where this isn't true, the formations that they've seen appear are usually single circles or maybe a couple of circles in a field. They are not complex formations like the pictograms and agroliths. No one, as far as I know, has seen one of those form. Now that's curious, isn't it? Why? There should by now be someone who's done that if this is a part of the phenomenon. Where were they in the past? A typical instance of this happening was a case at Blythe in Northumberland, where a couple saw, well, they didn't really see very much because the thing apparently came down from the sky. It was invisible. This is why Terence Meaden thinks it supports his theory of it being an airborne effect. And it sort of appeared to be a corkscrew. They could tell from the way it was sort of affecting the loose corn on the top of the field. And it produced a circle in a matter of seconds on the ground below them. Then this effect corkscrewed back up again and dissipated, so it appeared to have risen to a few feet above the field, and then some distance away across the field it happened again. It came down and it produced a second circle. Now this might explain why in these instances, if this is the kind of effect that Dr. Meaden is suggesting, there is no trail of debris across the field like we would expect. It's as if it's something that's sort of mostly just above ground level and is sort of temporarily coming down and touching the ground like a finger, rising up again and then coming down. Of course, what they saw could have had an explanation in an entirely different way. They could have seen a completely different force. They are not saying and cannot say, we saw what Dr. Meaden says is going on. But of course, what they are describing is effectively some kind of, what if you're taking the simplest possible route, some kind of natural phenomenon. Dr. Meaden produced a book called Circle Effect and Its Mysteries, in which he laid out his theory of what was going on, and where he brought into it new complications, where he was now suggesting that as this rotating force was very strong. It was actually charging the air and producing a kind of ionization effect around it, which could cause it to glow sometimes and be seen as strange lights in the sky, and could, of course, also produce residual electrical field effects, maybe magnetic effects, microwave effects, things like that, on the ground down below. So he was trying to bring in some of these anomalous findings that were being discovered elsewhere. He is not a loner. He does have support from quite a lot of people. Paul Fuller and I have actually found about 30 or 40 meteorologists and physicists from some prestigious establishments. There are several in universities in this country. There are quite a few in Japan. There are 2 leading physicists from Japan who do endorse his work, are prepared to cooperate with it, are in fact running research projects of their own. So there is a growing groundswell of support amongst meteorologists and physicists, although it is by no means overwhelming, and there are obviously people who don't agree with his ideas. This is a book which he also produced, which is a compilation of papers that were presented at a conference in Oxford in 1990, which scientists from 3 continents came together to give their papers on latest research into the field, again showing you that there is scientific research going on into this aspect now. Basically, he's arguing that we do have rotational effects in nature. If you look at a view of a hurricane cloud from space and compare it with the kind of Catherine wheel effect of a crop circle from above, you can see they're not dissimilar. And you can get an impression as to why it is conceivable to see the link between the 2 effects. And you can see, therefore, why some scientists would be driven towards looking for that explanation as a possible way in to solve this phenomenon. And when you look at the way in which the crop seems to be splayed out in some of the circles, again, it gives you the impression of a kind of downblast of air. That's the best way of if you were to come up with a snap judgment of what caused that, this sort of fan effect, that's probably what most of you would rationally conclude, if there was some way of doing it, would be the most likely explanation for producing an effect like that. Whirlwinds can work in fields. This is a whirlwind travelling across unfortunately an already harvested field in August of 1976, and it didn't leave a crop circle. If it had stood still, it might have done in other circumstances, but of course it didn't, and most whirlwinds do travel. Whirlwinds of that description, which usually appear during the day in hot, stable weather conditions, can, under some circumstances, if you can find a way of maybe backing them up into a standstill, which is what Terence Beaden's original idea was. He conceived of them being backed up in the slopes of a hill by the various layers of air, and therefore temporarily brought to a standstill, and they sort of used up their force as they were forced to sort of basically push down into there's the 2 layers of air that meet on the hill slope. They're forced to a standstill, and they expend their energy by moving downwards and producing the circle and then dying over a very short period of time, just a couple of seconds possibly. That was his working theory. He abandoned that somewhat and went on to this more complex idea of what he called a plasma vortex, which is on the same sort of lines, but it was different in the sense that he was using that to try and explain why most of the circles appeared to be forming during the night. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the eyewitness evidence of crop circles actually forming, the vast majority of them actually fit his early idea, this fair weather stationary whirlwind, not the plasma vortex. Virtually all of the eyewitness accounts seem to relate to daytime observations of crop circles forming by what does appear to be one of these fair weather stationary whirlwinds. That's a puzzle. I mean, I have a very good case from Marple in Cheshire, where a circle was left in grass outside a school field, and where the school children actually saw the loose hay being taken up from this field by what they described as looking like a UFO. It was actually a sort of dark lens-shaped thing, which turned out to be the loose hay, which had been swirled into a lens shape and was literally hovering above this circle which had been left on the ground. And then it seemed to form some sort of buoyant stasis position in the atmosphere and started to move off horizontally over their heads. And as it moved over their heads, they felt a strange pressure sensation pushing down on them above, tingling sensation too, as if there was an electrostatic field associated with it. As this got over the distance, maybe another quarter of a mile, half mile away, it seemed to lose energy, and this hay began to fall down from the sky. And deposited itself over a whole area of street and a slope of a hill. This was on a slope of a hill, just like Dr. Meaden proposed it should be. But none of these eyewitness accounts are fitting his more recent modified and complex version, which he's developed in as an attempt to try to explain the more complex formations. There is some degree of evidence to support that there is a meteorological link. These are two studies that have been carried out by meteorologists trying to verify Meaden's theory, which shows that there is a bit of a relationship beginning to appear between crop circle formations and their proximity to hill slopes, which is what he says should happen, but certainly on his original theory particularly, and what the least superficially the evidence may seem to suggest. And in Japan, they've actually been trying to duplicate this by producing his rotating air with an electrical field associated with it in the laboratory. And they are producing these kind of finger of electrical fire effects, which they fire down. And they do exactly what those witnesses at Blythe suggested that it might do. They sort of hover in the air for a time, and then occasionally they'll just point down and jab down into the ground, and will produce, because he's actually produced them on tin foil and on dust and other effects in the laboratory, resemblances of crop circles. They're not exactly the same by any stretch of the imagination. But there have been a number of attempts. There are now serious scientific attempts to try and get this theory to be verified in objective ways. And the electrical field association with circles also does exist within the UFO literature. Here we have a case from Florida, as long ago as 40 years ago, famous case where an object appeared above the witness. There was a flattened circle on the ground. We can't say whether it was the same thing as a crop circle because no photographs exist of it, but there was a very strong electrical field associated with this. It burnt holes from the sparks which emerged from this thing through the hat that the scoutmaster was wearing, and it also did very unusual things to the grass samples, as you can see down below. It actually seemed to fry them by cooking the roots black, but the part that was above the surface, the tops of the plants, were not affected at all, as you can see from those pictures. So it's not dissimilar sort of effects to the ones we're seeing now. And again, direct evidence linking the UFO phenomenon in its old disguise with the crop circles of today. Since I've probably run over time, and obviously we'll want to have opportunity for George to have his say, I think I'll probably not show any more of my slides, but just to sort of conclude, sort of putting my thoughts together on this, what I will say is that I've not been attempting to tell you what is going on. All I've been attempting to do is show you the way in which the phenomenon has pieced itself together as I've seen it over the past 12 years or so. There are lots of little clues that we're all bringing out, and which obviously all form part of our search for an explanation of what is going on. I certainly don't close my mind to any of those. I urge you not to do the same. We all have to look at ways and means in which we could find the answer. I think that it really rests probably on the question of these complex formations, for me at the moment. I don't know whether it will turn out that all of those complex formations that have appeared over the last couple of years will be hoaxes. If they are hoaxes and what we're actually left with is a base phenomenon of just these more simpler patterns, then it seems reasonable still that there could be some kind of a meteorological explanation. Maybe not exactly what Terence Meaden is saying, maybe more akin to his early ideas. Maybe there's some way that we can find a new methodology within those lines which could fit in. But I think that we probably have to look towards a natural phenomenon to account for this phenomenon which has been around for a long time and has more or less stayed the same and appears all over the world and can be seen by witnesses forming circles. But, and that's the big but and the crucial but, if these complex formations turn out not to be hoaxed, and if it's demonstrated that they are clearly exactly the same as the other circles, and that there are, if it is ever verified that there are considerable changes within the crop structure, and I'm personally, as of yet, not satisfied that that's the case, despite what Linda said before about those radionuclide results. My understanding of it is that they're not as clear-cut as you might believe, and that Marshall Dudley himself is unhappy about some aspects of the work that they did, so much so that they've decided that they do have to duplicate them this year. Even worse, there are some researchers, and I don't know who's right and who's wrong here, who argue that some of the positive results he's claiming are from a circle which they believe beyond a shadow of a doubt has been demonstrated to be a hoax. Now, if that's true, that's extremely worrying, of course. So, in other words, this question is still open. But if we can get that evidence that is going to verify this kind of change, if you like, occurring within these complex formations, then obviously I think we're in a whole new situation. I wonder myself if there's not maybe a kind of hybrid explanation here that we could possibly bring to bear. Is it conceivable that there was a meteorological effect of some description, or a natural effect of some description, which has always been around and which has been responsible for a few circles year in, year out all over the world for centuries or decades at least, and that now that the world has paid so much attention to the crop circles, that has been the stimulus just over the last 2 or 3 years for something else to occur. Now, whether that something else is a result of our attention, whether it's some sort of awakening of almost like universal consciousness of ourselves, in other words, we ourselves are the intelligence that's responsible for the circles, or whether someone somewhere else has seen our piqued interest in this phenomenon, which was actually no big deal, but they've said, aha, now what can we do with that interest? How can we use it to good advantage? I don't know. That is literally no more than a thought or an idea that might work as a way of explaining the problems that we face. I do know that the events of the recent past have made me, at least personally, think that it's more, not less likely, that there is more to this phenomenon than hoaxing and some kind of a meteorological effect. But I think I will show you this. I wasn't going to show you this, but I'll skip through a couple of photographs I was going to show you this, which is possibly, we can't prove this, but is possibly a photograph of whatever it is that produces the circles. This is a strange, white, vortex-shaped phenomenon in daylight, which was seen by a witness and photographed, as you can see, over Cumbria in England in July 1977. He says it was rotating. In fact, he personally likened it to a tornado funnel cloud at the time, but said it was quite different. He'd seen a tornado funnel cloud and it was not like this, besides which it was glowing with this sort of internal energy, as you can see. This was not directly responsible, so far as we know, for producing a crop circle, but certainly in the same area, within a couple of miles of where this was photographed, within that period of time, within a day or so, because we don't know the exact date when it formed, a circle was discovered in a field. So it is conceivable that this is in some way related. There are a couple of other cases, like the film you saw of the object flitting around a circle. We don't know what that is. We don't even know whether it's directly related to the circles, because it was flying over a circle after the circle had formed, so there's no direct link, just as there's no direct link here. But there are clues that we've got to piece together. And I think that really is probably the appropriate place to end, because George is going to give you a lot more clues from his own perspective, which I hope you'll listen to in the same way as you've kindly listened to what I've had to say. And then maybe at the end we'll be able to synthesize something out of all of this which will give us an insight into what is taking place. But all I will heed you to do is not to jump to conclusions about this. We're still at the start of our investigation of this phenomenon, I fear. And it's early days to conclude that we absolutely know what's going on. We don't, we have clues, we're working towards an answer, and let's just have a bit more harmony, understanding and open-mindedness about what exactly there is to take into account. Thanks very much.